But now it's my pleasure and great honor not only to be part of IFOA, but to introduce Tim Cook. Cook presents his 2009 Charles Taylor Prize-winning book, Shock Troops, which follows the Canadian fighting forces during the titanic battles of Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days Campaign. Shock Troops builds on Volume 1 of Cook's national bestseller, At the Sharp End. Tim.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction there. It's my pleasure to be here tonight and to share the stage with my fellow writers. You've heard I'm the author of the two-volume history of Canadians fighting the Great War, At the Sharp End and Shock Troops. And I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to read less than the other writers who came up here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I became interested in the Great War and some of the influences, and I'll read just a little bit as well. I've spent years, decades, studying the Great War. Two of them, I guess. I'm not that old. I've been in archives across Canada and around the world. I've written about it in articles and in other books. I've taught it to students at Carleton. I've set up exhibitions at the Canadian War Museum. And I wonder perhaps if, as one journalist remarked, I am indeed obsessed with it. They're probably right, I am. But I think obsessed is the wrong word. I think perhaps the word would be haunted. Ordinary Canadians form the core of my histories. And it's through their eyes that we experience the sharp end. It's these Canadians to who I've always been drawn. Who were they? It's sometimes hard to remember that these were men and women, flesh and blood, just like us. They were citizen soldiers, and that's an important thing. We didn't have much of a professional army in 1914 or throughout the war. They were farmers and clerks and bankers. They were blue-collar workers and middle-class workers. They were our fathers, our uncles, our sons. It's only been 90 years, but it seems longer, I think, perhaps because of the film that we see, that jerky film of them walking across our screens, smiling for the camera. But I'm haunted. I'm haunted by those faces. Over the years, I've read the letters or listened to the interviews of thousands of Canadian Great War soldiers, and it's their voices, their actions, their deeds, their horror and humanity, their laughter and sorrow that carry the narrative forward in this two-volume history. I felt impelled to write these two volumes, to remind us of this generation that served in the Great War. Now, the central spine of the story is of the Canadian Corps on the Western Front. That's our primary land formation. By 1916, 4 divisions strong, 100,000 soldiers. It's through those soldiers and through those experiences that we encounter the major battles and, of course, the experiences of the static warfare in the trenches. Trenches where they faced the flesh-engorged rats, the blood-sucking lice, the never-ending losses. Shock Troops picks up from there, covers the major battles that continue to the end of the war. It's a story that spans 4.5 years, although I do carry it forward to the present. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians, enormous formations. But I try to remember the Canadians who were there. Each has a story that adds to the collective, but also distinguishes from it. Introduce you perhaps to Gregory Clark. You'll, of course, recognize the name, the great Canadian humorist. He served in the Great War. I had the pleasure of reading his diary held at the National Archives, recently donated by his family. Gregory Clark was then a very young journalist here in Toronto. He went away on the 3rd of August, 1914, to his cottage. He came back 10 days later and found the country at war. And he didn't care very much. He wasn't really interested in it. But over the next year, he saw his friends and his colleagues slowly leave and go off. The churches emptied. The theaters emptied. And he felt the need to go. And he served. He arrived on the Western Front before the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April of 1917. Of course, Vimy Ridge, which people talk about as the birth of the nation, Vimy Ridge, where 4 divisions attacked together for the first time. Vimy Ridge, an enormous story of success and loss. But through his eyes, I experienced a whole new battle. He talked about lining up his platoon of roughly 50 men. He was a lieutenant. He talks about the creeping barrage crashing down over his head, this wall of shells. Literally, it felt above him, a cacophony of sound. Soldiers whose helmets were literally taken off their heads from low-flying shells. And he talked about advancing into the face of fire. And it's an awe-inspiring, because he's writing about this, and soldiers are falling around amongst him. And he makes it to his objective. And they don't find any Germans there. They've all been wiped out or run away. But for the next 3 days, he tries to hold that objective. Vimy Ridge, if you've been there, at the top of the ridge, the landscape reduced to a quagmire of mud and dismembered bodies. He races back and forth. He talks about seeing one of his friends, a chap he names Butson, standing there, a fellow lieutenant who is shot in the head through the temple, ripping out both of his eyeballs. He falls to the ground and he's holding Butson. He's holding him as he cries out for his mother and then dies. 3 days without sleep, 3 days of constant battle as the Germans counterattacked. He was finally relieved, awarded the Military Cross for bravery. He talks about trudging down this ridge and getting to the bottom and breaking into tears. That was his Vimy Ridge. No mention of Canada coming of age, simply tears for his fallen comrades. These 2 books take a hard look at the history of the war. I'm not interested in hagiography. I'm driven to explore the past in its complexities and its nuances. The book tackles hard questions, the question of mental breakdown among soldiers, shell shock as it was known. That did not mean that these men were cowards, only that they were human. I talk about the execution of 25 Canadians by their own soldiers, death by firing squad for men who could not fight anymore. I talk about the killing of prisoners by Canadians, a grim topic, but one that has to be explored to understand the complexities of the battlefield. I look at soldiers who shot themselves to escape the front, who could no longer stand it. We do no service to the past or the Canadians that served if we can decode it. War is about brutality and death and destruction. But within the darkness, there was a wonderfully acerbic gallows humor that kept men going. R.J. Mannion, a wartime medical officer and later leader of the Conservative Party, wrote of one cheeky soldier who arrived in his dressing station, he was a surgeon, just ripped through with shrapnel, bleeding out from at least a dozen wounds. Through gritted teeth, the wounded man joked, "You know, Doc, the main objection I have to death is that it's so damn permanent." Mannion recounted that the injured man died the next day, but there were others to fill the ranks. We're on the razor's edge of lived memory now. There is one Canadian veteran left. John Babcock is 109 years old. He is one of 3 in the entire world. I wonder what will happen when he passes away, when he marches into time to join his 600,000-odd companions, who I hope are waiting for him with his rum ration. The ghosts of the past continue to tread through our cultural landscape too. Witness in recent years novelists like Alan Cumming or Joseph Bowden, who keep the memory alive in their books, The Sojourn or 3 Day Road. Think of Paul Gross's Passchendaele blockbuster film. Now, Paul Gross himself has been haunted by the war. His grandfather served. He wanted to know more about that service. There may have been a bit too much passion at the expense of Passchendaele, but I thank Paul Gross for bringing that story to Canadians. The poppy, John McCrae's in Flanders Fields, 2 minutes of silence. These symbols still mean something to us. They still resonate, perhaps in a way quite unlike few other symbols and signs in Canadian history. I think even as the last veteran passes away, I think the Great War will haunt us still. We are not yet done with the Great War, and I suspect it is not yet done with us. Thank you.